Hello and welcome to Seattle City Makers. I'm your host, Jon Scholes. Well, welcome everybody to our latest episode where I sit down with Harvard professor of economics, Ed Glaeser, who was our keynote speaker last week at the Downtown Seattle Association's 18th annual State of Downtown event, which was held over at the gorgeous, gleaming new convention center building, the Summit Building, over there across from the Paramount Theater at 9th and Pine. It was so fun to get in that building with 1,200 plus individuals from the real estate and business community and leaders in arts and culture, and a number of our public officials, including Mayor Harrell and some city council members, folks from the Port of Seattle and King County government. A good time was had by all, and I hope many of you were able to join us. It was great to see that building full of people. The ballroom looked gorgeous. It's just terrific to get in there and see events taking place there. I also had the opportunity to moderate a panel there last week for the Northwest Events Show. So it's good to see that building getting use and getting people in and out of it. And it was a great time, and hope that many of you were able to make it. It's always a privilege for me to deliver our State of Downtown address. I think that was my 8th address in front of our members and members of the community on behalf of our board and the association. And if you missed that and want to check it out, it's on our YouTube channel, Downtown Seattle Association's YouTube channel. And I also had the opportunity to share some of my thinking on the pages of the Seattle Times last week on the must-dos to further the revitalization of downtown Seattle. So you can check out that op-ed that should still be online at the Seattle Times if you are interested. And I sat down with Professor Ed Glaeser, who's the chair of the Department of Economics at Harvard University, been there since 1992, wrote the book Triumph of the City in 2011, and more recently published Survival of the City in 2021. He grew up in New York City in the 1970s and 80s. He's written extensively on cities and their economies and public policy affecting our urban places, on their resiliency, on their economic potential and promise. And we sat down just before our event last week, and I asked him to give us a preview of some of the ground he was going to cover at the event for those that might not have been able to make it. So we do cover a good amount of ground on his perspective on office conversion to residential, the resiliency of our cities, how we bring back vibrancy, and how we build back in a better way, recognizing some of the challenges that our urban areas faced prior to the pandemic, and certainly the challenges that were brought on over these last couple of years by the pandemic. Hope you enjoy my conversation with Harvard professor Ed Glaeser. Thanks again for making time coming out to Seattle. And,
it's a great pleasure to be back here.
And so you remarked last night when we were talking that this is your, 10th, 11th visit, and you still hadn't seen Mount Rainier. I think this is your day, though.
I'm pretty excited. I've thought it was an urban myth for a long time, but it's
it wasn't. It's not theoretical. The skies are blue today, but you haven't seen it yet, I imagine.
No.
Okay. Today's the day, I think. So you're speaking later today at our 18th annual State of Downtown event. And for those, and we're recording this before the event, obviously, and it'll publish after the event. But for those that maybe won't be among the 1,200, 1,300 people in attendance, give us a little preview of what you're going to say.
Absolutely. So this has been a rough time for cities. The past 3 years have been an age of pandemic, and there've been a period in which people have discovered that for many ordinary tasks, they can do that virtually. And right now in Seattle, as is true throughout many cities throughout the world, many offices remain relatively empty. People remain wearing masks. They remain frightened of the comeback of the plague. I believe that despite these challenges, the age of the city is far from over. And indeed, in many ways, I think cities are likely to be even more exciting in the years ahead. One of the reasons for my optimism is that this is not the first time we've thought about electronic technology making face-to-face interactions in the cities that enable those interactions obsolete, right? In 1980, Alvin Toffler wrote a book, The Third Wave, that argued that, the hot new IT of his age, which meant fax machines and personal computers, were going to cause us all to decamp from our urban offices, and we're going to leave cities, and we're going to inhabit electronic cottages and just dial in.
Spend all day faxing each other from the hinterlands.
Absolutely. And for 40 years, he was completely and totally wrong, because what happened was that all this new technology, the globalization that came along radically increased the returns to being smart. It radically increased the returns to innovation. And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. And so far from, urban real estate collapsing, we've had a golden age of urban renaissance where cities like Seattle, places that, have a strong, robust human capital and innovation-related economy, have really thrived. And they thrive as places where people can come and learn and figure out how to do amazing things that change our future. And that's how it's been here, right? I mean, it's easy to forget now, but 52 years ago, two jokers put up a billboard on the highway leaving Seattle asking the last person to leave the city to please turn out the lights.
We've had our past challenges.
You have, right? Because Boeing was cutting back on jobs.
Yeah.
And just as no one could imagine a Detroit with a smaller General Motors, no one could imagine Seattle with a smaller Boeing. That was before Amazon, before Starbucks, before Microsoft, before Costco, right? All of these new innovative companies came along after that, and they filled in the space that a slightly smaller Boeing had left. And that was, that's happened before, and it will surely happen again. One of the ways to think about sort of what Zoom has done is it does allow us to do sort of ordinary interactions fairly easily. What it is not nearly as good at is as a machine for enabling learning. Either the sort of high-intensity interactions, the reading each other's body language, the figuring out sort of what really matters, or the, spontaneous random things that you just see. The great English economist Alfred Marshall wrote almost 140 years ago or so that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air. And this is the view of cities as really places of learning, places where we, come and we learn our skills. There are two really nice papers on remote work that find this fact. And often, the first fact in both these papers gets trumpeted at the expense of the second. The first fact is that when you send call center workers home, whether or not in China, Nick Bloom of Stanford is a wonderful economist, did this experiment. They go home, they're just as productive making those calls.
And that's been happening for some time, pre-pandemic.
He did that in 2014, this paper. And we have other students, Natalia Emanuel and Emma Harrington, who did this in a U.S. context, found the same thing. Both studies found exactly the same thing, though. Your probability of being promoted dropped by over 50% if you were remote. Right, which makes it so
even doing that call center work.
Even doing that call center work. What being promoted means in a call center is you get to handle the really difficult calls, right? You get to handle the really obnoxious clients. And how would you know how to do that? Well, you get paid more, so it does. People do actually want to be promoted. And how would you learn how to do that if you were all by yourself in isolation? How would your boss know that you were good at doing that if you were in isolation? So you've shut off the learning channel. This is why I'm sort of fundamentally optimistic about the nature of cities. And Greater Seattle's human capital base is so strong, given that we're in a world in which individuals, nations, and cities rise and fall on the human capital. This gives Seattle an enormous asset, which is pinned down by its enormous natural beauty as well. But that being said, Zoom does mean that talent is more mobile than ever, right? And I can't imagine a world in which, some smart startup is going to say, oh, let's just go home to our suburban homes somewhere and never see each other. But I can certainly imagine they're going to say, let's go to Austin and not pay state taxes. Let's go to Honolulu and surf. Let's go to Colorado and ski. So that means that, in fact, the fight to maintain talent has never been more important. And that really requires a relentless focus on quality of life, a relentless focus on the amenities that actually will draw highly skilled people both to the Seattle area and also downtown. And that means safe streets, that means easy commutes, that means permitting for new businesses that's pretty light, that enables the sort of natural creativity of people in cities to actually generate the joys that make cities fun to be in. But there is a battle for human capital, and really that's the future.
And the irony of the claim that technology, and your point of this has been said for 40 plus years, is going to be the end of cities, is that to make that technology more advanced and have greater impact on our world and how we live and work and transfer knowledge, we've had to have human beings next to each other in close proximity, right? So it's sort of in a lot of ways done the exact opposite, or at least that's what the last 20 years in places like downtown Seattle, San Francisco, and others have seen, right?
Absolutely. And tech companies throughout America didn't think the right answer was to send everyone home. They thought the right answer was to have everyone next to each other.
And so you hit the point of the importance of quality of life in our urban places. I couldn't agree more. It seems like we've struggled for decades in the U.S. to get that right in our downtowns and urban areas relative to some other places around the world that have been much more urban for far longer than we have. Why do you think that's the case? And do you have optimism that as we come out of this, that we may no longer sort of shrug off negative quality of life issues as, oh, these are big cities with big city problems?
I don't think we can ever shrug them off. I mean, there is, the narrative of Seattle is one of great renaissance after the 1970s. That's not the narrative of Cleveland, Detroit, or St. Louis, right? There are cities that were once American urban giants that are, their downtowns certainly are shadows of their former self, 50% fewer people than they had in 1950. And quality of life was not the only story. In all of these cases, a big part of it was economic dislocation.
Yeah, industry picking up and moving out. Yeah.
But in Seattle, right, the industry also declined, but because there were skilled people there who wanted to stay there, right, who liked the place, right, it was able to reinvent itself.
Not an obligation.
Whereas people had a different view towards Detroit. People had a different view towards Cleveland. And so the quality of life is not something that can be shrugged off. It is a crucial ingredient in the battle for global talent.
And do you think that our cities have been moving toward places of obligation where, here in the early 1900s, you came through to get provisions to go seek gold in Alaska. So you had to come here and load up. And you had all these businesses open 24 hours a day servicing that. And then we had manufacturing and industry, before that, timber and running, down Skid Row here in Seattle, and industry and all kinds of other cities. And then the manufacturing jobs left. But there's this sort of progression of these obligations. If you wanted to engage in economic activity, or arts and culture and other things, you had to first kind of be in the city, and then we had, the suburbs develop. Do you think we're continuing to be on that sort of, where cities, urban areas are becoming less of a place of obligation, need to become more of a place of destination where you're choosing to be there?
Absolutely, right? In 1900, transportation costs, in a sense, were destiny, right? I mean, it was just incredibly expensive to move wood long distances. And so you really wanted to be near the port, right? You really wanted to be near the rail yard. Over the course of the 20th century, the real cost of moving a ton of mile by rail declined by over 90%, right? And it became much, much easier to move yourself, move people. And so the proximity that cities offer was no longer an economic necessity. It has the advantage because it brings people together and enables them to have fun, to find joy, to learn from each other, to do all these wonderful things. But the cities have got to make the case. It's not automatic anymore.
And where do you come down on the, it seems like some people are suggesting there's one end of the continuum here as we look post-pandemic in our urban areas, that you've got to radically remake them, reinvent them. Let's rename them from centers of commerce to centers of connection. And we're massive conversion of office to residential, and they have to become very, very different places to be successful and vibrant. And then on the other end of the continuum, there's maybe a school of thought of, no, the ingredients have always been the right ingredients, and we just have to focus on the fundamentals that have always made cities desirable places. So that as you think about how we emerge, particularly with U.S. downtowns and urban areas, kind of where do you fall? Is this a radical remake and makeover of what we need to be doing and how they need to function and who they need to serve? Or does it skew more toward, no, the basics and fundamentals, we know what makes these places tick and be desirable?
So I'm between those two extremes. In a sense, in many cases, I would like to much more radically shift commercial space into residential space, right? Certainly Seattle is far from extreme in this, right? If we think about sort of downtown New York, there's a huge demand for residences and there's a large-scale office problem. That becomes really hard, especially with post-war office buildings. They're just not laid out at all for residential space. And in many cases, the right answer to providing more residential space is just to provide more residential space rather than to try and reconfigure it. I've seen some creative things in Seattle in terms of the ground floor retail. I mean, that's another thing that, buying ordinary goods at urban stores is just much less necessary than it once used to be. And, you walk around Seattle, you see it's been turned into a child care. It's been turned into a dog care. It's and that adds visual interest, and it's kind of fun. I mean, human creativity will figure out how to use these spaces without us trying to manage it from the top down. It may take a little bit of time to do that. So I do think cities need to change, as they always have. I mean, in my lifetime, New York had to change from being an industrial behemoth to being a behemoth based on business and financial services, and that was a wrenching change. But it happened, and that will continue to happen. I think from the perspective of the government or from civic entities like like your own, it's much more of a focus on the basics, on how is it that we make sure that these streets are fun and safe and, a joy to be in. How is it that we empower the ordinary entrepreneurs who make cities fun? I mean, one of my pet causes on this is I always get a little bit outraged in the fact that America regulates the entrepreneurship of the poor so much more strictly than it regulates the entrepreneurship of the rich, right? If you want to start your internet phenomenon in your Harvard College dorm, you can do so then, have basically no regulators before you have 1 billion users.
Yeah.
If you want to start a grocery store that sells milk products, 4 blocks away, you've got 18 permits before you can start selling.
True. I heard a story the other day from a couple in North Seattle. They've got a retail spot looking to open another up there, looking to open another in downtown Seattle, waiting 10 months for a plumbing permit. And we built a railroad tunnel in 20 months in 1904 and the Space Needle in 400 days in 1962. And they're waiting 10 months for a plumbing permit.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of one-stop permitting. Mm-hmm. So something where there's just a central office, and even if they still have to go out to specific agencies, it's on them to get that done quickly. And the part of the beauty of having a central office is that you actually can judge how they're doing. Whereas if you currently have 37 different agencies that do think, oh, it's the fire guys, they're the problem.
Right.
Or, oh, it's these guys, that's the problem. So there's no responsibility.
Yeah, no accountability in the process. What is, if anything, has changed around your point of view from when you wrote Triumph of the City more than 10 years ago and sort of post-pandemic? Are there things, beliefs that you held then that were reflected in that book that have been challenged or changed by the pandemic and its effect on our urban areas?
So the things that I think that I underestimated, and some of it is not pandemic, some of it is just data that's come about. Mm-hmm. In the Opportunity Atlas work of my colleague Raj Chetty and his co-authors, cities do a worse job of enabling kids to find upward mobility than I would have expected, mm-hmm. right? So, and I grew up myself in, a fairly dense part of Manhattan. So, it seemed like it was doing okay for me. So I probably didn't pay enough attention to that. Even when you control for family incomes, cities look kind of bad. And it's sort of a paradox about why cities are really quite good for adults, not just in a static sense, but in a dynamic sense, in the sense you get faster wage growth if you come to cities mm-hmm. as an adult. But not good for kids. And I think one hypothesis, which there is some evidence, supporting, is that adults who come to cities live pretty integrated lives. Even if they're relatively low, income immigrants to America, they'll typically work in an office. They'll interact with people who are, from very different backgrounds. They'll find all sorts of ways of figuring out how to better their lives because they're part of the whole economic maelstrom of the city.
They're in a bunch of other venues with people that aren't exactly like themselves.
Exactly. By contrast, if you're a kid growing up in a public housing project, you're living in a high poverty area, dealing with other children of the poor, and you're almost assuredly going to a very segregated school. And so you live a life that's much more cocooned and much less able to take advantage of the full panoply of things that exist in a city. So that is certainly one of the things that I got wrong. I did not focus enough on that. The issue of unaffordability in cities has only gotten worse. I'm not sure I would say that I got that wrong. I guess I probably was more hopeful that, more could be done, but I'm not sure that I really, that was probably overly optimistic at the time. I paid probably too little attention at that point in time to the rise of prime age joblessness in America, right? So that's one of the ways in which my thinking has changed, which does not make me less urban. In fact, if anything, it makes me more, because when I think about where less skilled Americans can find jobs, it's in places like here, Seattle, right? It's being part of the great urban service economy of providing various things for tech workers or whoever else has money. What I don't understand is what less skilled Americans are going to do in West Virginia. Right, what I don't understand is that, and that's sort of that, and being
where's that urban center,
right? Where the customers for the urban services, right? And it's really important to remember that being jobless is just associated with so much more misery, so much more opioid abuse than being a low income worker, right? Because in all senses, right, going to work is not just about earning any income. It's about social connection. It's about a sense of purpose. It's about all sorts of things which are really good in people's lives.
Structure, purpose. So you brought up, affordability issues and, cities like Seattle, San Francisco, New York, Chicago prior to the pandemic were flying high, attracting all this investment and tech jobs and, lots of service jobs to bring people food and walk their dogs and take care of the daily things in their lives that they'd rather pay somebody else to do. And those service workers being pushed further and further out of cities, longer commutes. And it feels like that model was certainly being tested and in some ways sort of fraying and in some of these places, in my opinion, we're becoming almost too one-dimensional. Where, if you were making six figures, if you had great stock options, you could afford the $22 cocktails after work with your friends and the really expensive rent in an apartment with a great view. The downtown worked wonderful for you, but for a lot of other people, it didn't. What do we do about that? As you note, affordability is still an issue post-pandemic in many of these places, and we still need a lot of those service jobs to help make these downtowns run.
Yeah, I think it's a great shame in this country that so many of our cities have gotten out of the business of building large-scale middle-class housing, right? Now, just to be clear, the most natural way for, to house the poor is with older housing. So that's in all of the sort of older cities in the U.S. You have, a legacy stock, and just like buying a used car, having some form of used home is the more natural thing. Seattle has less of that. I mean, it has some, but it's because it's grown so much. It doesn't have the sort of 80-year-old apartment stock that is a natural place. And so there's a particular priority here to figure out how you can make it really easy to mass produce housing, not that's necessarily income delimited, but like, just smaller units that are, that the landlord's going to make money from, but that it's going to be more in range for ordinary workers, not just people not just people with lots of stock options.
Do you think governments up at all levels is up to the task of supporting what's needed to reimagine and revitalize our urban areas? Are we organized in the right way and focused in the right way?
Those are not questions I ask very much because changing the nature of American government doesn't seem like a very easy task. But certainly when I look at which types of government I like, certainly city governments tend to get it wrong. I see a lot more to love in our city governments than even our state governments than I do in our federal government. So, and I think there are often amazing things that are happening in different mayor's offices and different city managers' offices. And I think that as long as you don't view the mayor or the mayor and the city council as being lone actors, I think our cities have enough to reinvent themselves because the community can come together and provide the things that they can't, right? There's a long tradition of this. I mean, one of the stories I tell in Survival is about how the Croton Aqueduct got built. And that was not an issue. I mean, there was a mayor who was the center, but it actually was not when he was mayor. It was actually after when he was mayor. He led a civic coalition to do this thing. Just like 40 years later, as Dr. Stephen Smith leads a civic coalition to put through a board of health that actually starts cleaning up the city. All of this represented the city, the community coming together and making itself better. That's how cities really change.
You think we put too much expectation maybe on our municipal governments to lead us out and maybe miss our historic achievements that were really spurred by the private sector?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that this was not like just leave it to the market. I'm not saying that at all. That was not either of these stories. These stories were like concerted groups that figured out how to combine private and public resources to do something fairly amazing.
And deliver broad public good and
clean water for right. I mean, right? But it is very much a thing in which you shouldn't leave the government up to the government, right? It should be something in which we all get engaged and all try to make it better.
Who's doing it well from your perspective around the country as we try to emerge from a difficult few years on our urban areas?
Look, it's very hard because the cities that are thriving are rarely thriving because they've got a fantastic public sector that is doing a superb job.
They have sunny weather.
They have sunny weather. They have, they're endowed with public universities.
First,
I mean, Austin, Texas is the superstar of this time period. And Austin has a relatively pro-business environment. It has a great nationally ranked university. And it's, just been, and it has no state income tax, and it's done fantastically well for attracting areas. Miami too has been, again, no income tax, hugely attractive, right? So these are, and the warm weather. I don't think we look at Seattle or Boston and say, oh, this is all the fault of our government. Although Massachusetts just changed our constitution to allow a millionaire's tax, which I can't imagine a worse timing of that. That it's, you want to just encourage them to follow Ken Griffin down to Miami? Is that what you try to do with our? Yes, people are more mobile than ever. Why are you taxing your? But I don't think there's a clear sort of people who are doing it exactly right. And I think by and large, Seattle has been reasonably well run over the past 40 or 50 years. I mean, Washington has been, always been good in terms of focusing on education, and that's in some sense the most important thing for the long run.
Do you think we have an appreciation of the importance of our urban areas in this country? It seems like we need them to be in crisis to appreciate them and recognize their significance once again.
We're terrible, right? I mean, we have part of our baked-in thing is we're cowboys, we're pioneers, if you show me a guy who has a single-family detached house in L.A. and he does not think of himself as an urbanite. She does not think of herself as. She thinks of herself as being a lone homesteader out in the American West who's doing. It's very funny. I mean, this goes back to Thomas Jefferson and sort of thinking of somehow there's something deeply un-American about cities. It's baked into the home mortgage interest deduction as well, which acts as if like the American dream can only be behind a white picket fence, not behind an urban rental apartment. So I think you're right. I think it is sadly true that it takes a crisis, and we tend to undervalue them when they're performing really well. And it's really important to recognize how much of what's great in America came out of cities. One of my favorite cultural things of the past decade has been Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton. In part, the Hamilton story is a celebration of cities' ability to, embrace immigrants, to enable them to find their future, to contribute enormously to their country. And Hamilton, in some sense, stands on the urban side of the poll against Jefferson.
I appreciated your perspective on growing up in New York in the 70s and 80s. I think you described it as both wonderful and terrifying at the same time. And so this appreciation for the nuance and multiple truths that are often the case in our cities. And it seems like we struggle with that in kind of assessing their health or their significance. They're either dying or overpriced and the Yogi Berra quote of "it's so crowded nobody goes there anymore." And I guess there's not a question there other than just appreciating the nuance from your perspective and growing up in a place that had a lot of good things going and not so many good things at that point in time with crime rates and everything else.
That's certainly right. And it's like even in the best of circumstances in which, cities remain magnets for talent and the downtowns thrive, there's still the problem of upward mobility for lower income urbanites. I mean, that's a huge agenda. The schools agenda for America remains enormous. I've sort of almost given up on the ability of large scale school reform in the U.S. and sort of would like to see more things like experimentation with after school vocational training, programs on weekends, programs during the summer. And part of the beauty of vocational training is you can actually pay for performance. So you can actually say, Carpenters Union, you want to compete in providing this? Great. Private sector thing, you want to compete this? Great. But you know what? We're going to be able to tell whether or not the person is a trained carpenter by the time you're done, and you're only going to get paid if you actually do that.
Yeah.
Programming too, right? You can pay for performance. It's
So you have a speech to give later today, so I could talk to you all day, but I don't want to strain your voice, although I know you're pretty good at talking for quite a while as a professor. But I want to conclude with a question that we ask each of our guests, and I'll modify it a little bit. Our standard question is your perfect Saturday in the city of Seattle, what your itinerary is. But what's your perfect Saturday in your perfect city? What's your itinerary? What are you doing?
I'm not going to tell you what my perfect city is, but because I don't have one. That's like having a perfect child or something like that. And
I'm picking favorites.
Cities that I love are all imperfect. So it's, okay, I'll just think about sort of urban moments that I love. So let's say I'm wandering around Tokyo. I'm just observing urban life. I'm trying to figure out the history of it and how it connects to the present. And I'm almost assuredly listening to something on Audible. Let's choose something that's related to it. Let's choose Robert Caro's The Power Broker, or one of our favorite urban books while I'm listening to. But I do tend to walk around cities a lot, listening to some form of history.
Tapping all your senses.
Yeah.
Are you someone who goes to a new place with a plan and a real specific set of places and things you want to do, or do you sort of let it develop?
I usually have a couple of destinations, but as I wander from one destination to the other, I let it develop.
Where are you headed to this summer that you're excited about? Any interesting travel plans?
I don't know yet, but it'll be urban.
Very good. Well, I look forward to your remarks this afternoon. Appreciate you giving folks who weren't able to join us a preview, and thanks for making it out to this coast and to Seattle. And congratulations on your book and all your success, and thanks for making us think about the importance of cities and how we make them even better on the other side of this pandemic.
Well, thank you for having me on, and thank you for all that you do to try and make your city better.
Very good. Well, hope you enjoyed my conversation with Professor Glaeser. I'm really grateful for him making the time to join us on Seattle City Makers and for making the time to come out to Seattle to keynote our State of Downtown event. If you missed his remarks at the event and you want to check those out, you can find them on the Downtown Seattle Association's YouTube channel. And be sure to pick up his most recent book, Survival of the City. And if you haven't read his previous book, Triumph of the City, both are terrific, and both can be found online or at your favorite brick and mortar bookshop, I'm sure. They're pretty widely available, and highly recommend them. I want to close out, as I do each and every episode, with a recommendation of what you just can't miss in downtown Seattle. This could be something that has recently reopened, something that is brand new, or something that is on the way. And I've got a few recommendations for you of things that have reopened, things that are new, and a few things that are on the way. They all happen to be on Pine Street, and they all happen to be food and beverage establishments. So first off, Ethan Stoll is going to have a pretty cool new, I think, 2-story double-decker cocktail lounge and Italian joint in the convention center on the corner of 9th and Pine. Go check that out. It's going to be phenomenal. It'll be open later this spring. And then adjacent to Ethan, we're going to have a new Proshki, a new location for Pike Brewing Company, and a new monorail espresso, all there in the ground floor of the convention center on Pine Street. That's going to be just a great stretch of some of Seattle's favorite food and beverage joints. And then as you make your way down the hill toward the water, Chan has reopened in a new location. Used to be over at the Pike Place Market. The great Korean joint is now in a sleek new spot in the Paramount Hotel, next to a new breakfast spot also run by the same owner called Spruce. I've, I think, mentioned that on a previous episode. So both of those are at the corner of 8th and Pine in the Paramount Hotel. And then at the corner of 7th and Pine, a reopening of Ryder. They'll be open later this spring. Terrific restaurant and bar, great cocktails, great meat and fish and veggies on that massive grill that they had there in the restaurant. They've been closed for 3+ years, and will have their doors reopen later this spring. Grateful to have them back in the neighborhood. And if you haven't checked out the new Asian street food hall at the ground floor of Westlake Center, be sure to check that out. They opened a few months back, and a bunch of different options for Asian street food from Southeast Asia for lunch and dinner, open from 11 a.m. till 9 p.m. in the ground floor of Westlake Center. So a bunch of new options that are reopened, that are new, and that are coming on Pine Street. So it's great to see these establishments and these ground floors reactivated and more life returning to the core of our downtown. So check all those out. And I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of Seattle's City Makers, presented by the Downtown Seattle Association, with support from James Cito and production by Spark Creative.